Sometimes the most broken places hold the greatest treasures, and sometimes a child's pure heart can see what adults have long forgotten. 9-year-old Annie Grant had nothing left to lose when she heard about the ghost town auction. Just her, loyal German Shepherd Duke, and a crumpled $100 bill that represented her last hope for a real home. The desert town of Dusthaven had been empty for 60 years. Folks said it was cursed after the great fire that killed so many miners. But Annie saw something different in those weathered buildings and broken windows. She saw a place where she and Duke could finally belong. What she found instead was an old rusted door hidden beneath years of debris. Behind that door lay secrets that had been buried for generations, treasures, underground passages, and a mystery that some people would kill to keep hidden. But what happens when a little girl's innocent discovery threatens to expose the darkest secrets of the past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Annie Grant pressed her small face against the grimy window of Mel's diner, watching the desert wind push tumbleweeds down the empty main street of Cedar Falls, Nevada. Her fingers traced the chain around her neck, feeling for the familiar weight of her mother's locket, the only thing she had left from before. Inside the tarnished silver heart was a photograph so small she could barely make out her parents' faces anymore, but she knew they were smiling. They were always smiling in her memories. "Get away from that window, girl. You're leaving noseprints." The harsh voice belonged to Rita Connors, her foster mother for the past 8 months. Rita's thin lips were permanently pursed in disapproval, as if the whole world had personally offended her. Her husband, Frank, sat at the counter, methodically, working through a plate of eggs and bacon while discussing cattle prices with Mel, the diner's owner. Duke lay at Annie's feet, his amber eyes alert despite his relaxed posture. The German Shepherd had appeared in her life 3 years ago, shortly after the accident that took her parents. Some said he'd belonged to a family that moved away. Others claimed he was wild. But Annie knew better. Duke had chosen her, just as surely as she'd chosen him. In a world where adults shuffled her from house to house like an unwanted package, Duke was the one constant, her protector, her friend, her family. "That dog's getting too big," Rita muttered, sliding into the booth across from Annie. "Frank's already complaining about the food costs. Pretty soon we'll have to make some hard choices." Annie's hand instinctively moved to Duke's head, her fingers burying themselves in his thick coat. She'd heard this threat before, always delivered, with the same casual cruelty that Rita reserved for anything that brought Annie comfort. The woman had taken her in for the monthly check from the state, not out of any desire to provide a loving home. "He earns his keep," Annie said quietly. "He scared off those coyotes last month, remember? Don't get smart with me." Rita's voice carried the edge that meant trouble. "You're lucky we took you in at all. Most folks won't deal with a kid who comes with livestock." The conversation at the counter grew more animated as Mel leaned forward conspiratorially. "I'm telling you, Frank, it's the strangest thing I ever heard. Town auction next week, and they're starting the bidding at $100. 100! For a whole damn town!" Frank Connors grunted his interest. "What's the catch?" "No catch, legally speaking. Dusthaven's been sitting empty since 1963. County finally decided to stop paying for maintenance on property that ain't generating tax revenue. Figure someone might want to buy it for the land value, tear down those old buildings." "Dusthaven," Annie whispered, the name sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. She'd heard stories about the ghost town, whispered tales that made the local children dare each other to drive out there on Halloween nights. But Annie had never been afraid of ghosts. The living had always been far more terrifying. Mel warmed to his story, clearly enjoying his role as the town's unofficial news anchor. "Course, most folks think the place is cursed. That fire in '63 took out half the population overnight. Folks just packed up and left after that. Been sitting there ever since, waiting." "Waiting for what?" Frank asked. "That's the million-dollar question, ain't it? Some say there's still treasure buried out there from the mining days. Others think the whole place ought to be bulldozed and forgotten. Annie felt Duke's weight shift against her leg, his ears pricking forward as if he could sense her sudden interest. $100. She had exactly that much hidden in her backpack. Money. She'd saved from odd jobs around town, babysitting the younger foster kids, helping elderly Mrs. Patterson with her grocery shopping. She'd been saving it for something important, though she'd never known what. Now she did. "Rita," she said carefully, "could I go to that auction next week?" Rita snorted. "What would a kid want with a ghost town? You planning to play house in the desert?" "Maybe." Annie kept her voice level, though her heart was racing. "It's just $100. I have that much saved." "You got $100? Rita's eyes sharpened with interest. "Where'd you get that kind of money?" "I earned it. Fair and square." Annie met her foster mother's gaze steadily. "I'm allowed to have my own money. Not while you're living under my roof. You're not. Hand it over." "No." The word came out stronger than Annie had intended, surprising them both. Duke's ears flattened slightly, his protective instincts recognizing the shift in tension. Rita's face flushed red. "What did you say to me?" "I said no. That money is mine. I earned it, and I'm going to use it to buy that town." The diner had gone quiet. Mel, Frank, and the handful of other customers were all watching now, drawn by the rare sight of a child standing up to Rita Connors. Annie felt their eyes on her but kept her focus on Rita's furious face. "You ungrateful little—" Rita started to reach across the table, but Duke's low growl stopped her mid-motion. The dog hadn't moved, but something in his amber eyes made it clear that touching Annie would be a mistake. Frank finally looked up from his breakfast. "Rita, leave the kid alone. If she wants to waste her money on some fool notion, let her. Might teach her a lesson about the real world." Rita sat back, but her eyes promised retribution later. "Fine. But when you're stuck out there in the middle of nowhere with nothing but rattlesnakes and tumbleweeds, don't come crying to us." Annie nodded solemnly. "I won't." The truth was, she'd already made up her mind. Whatever lay waiting in Dusthaven, it had to be better than this. She had Duke, she had her mother's locket, and she had $100. Most importantly, she had hope. The kind of desperate, determined hope that only comes when you've got nothing left to lose. As they left the diner, Annie felt the weight of curious stares following them. By evening, the whole town would know about her plan. Some would call her foolish, others would whisper that the Connors family was finally getting rid of their unwanted burden. But Annie didn't care what they said. She was going to buy herself a town. That night, she lay in her narrow bed with Duke curled up on the floor beside her, despite Rita's standing rule about animals in the house. Through the thin walls, she could hear Frank and Rita arguing in low, vicious tones about money and responsibilities, and the burden of caring for someone else's child. Annie pulled her mother's locket from beneath her shirt, holding it close enough to catch the pale moonlight filtering through the threadbare curtains. The photograph inside was too faded to make out clearly anymore, but she could still remember. Her mother's voice, warm and gentle, reading her bedtime stories about brave children who found magic in unexpected places. "Tomorrow, Duke," she whispered, her fingers tangling in the dog's fur. "Tomorrow we start looking for our own magic." Duke's tail thumped once against the floor, a gesture so subtle that only Annie would have noticed. But it was enough. It was a promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. The desert wind howled outside, carrying with it the scent of sage and sand and something else, something that might have been possibility. In 7 days, there would be an auction. In 7 days, Annie Grant would take her first real step toward claiming the life she'd been dreaming of. She didn't know about the rusted door yet, or the underground chambers, or the dangerous men who had been waiting decades for someone brave enough or foolish enough to unlock Dusthaven's secrets. All she knew was that somewhere out in the vast Nevada desert, a ghost town was waiting for her. And for the first time in 3 years, that felt like home. The Lincoln County Courthouse steps blazed under the Nevada sun as Annie stood with Duke at her side, clutching the crumpled $100 bill in her sweaty palm. Around them, a small crowd had gathered, mostly local curiosity seekers and a few serious-looking men in expensive suits who kept checking their phones and whispering among themselves. "This is ridiculous," muttered Mrs. Hendricks from the post office. "Letting a child bid on property. What's this world coming to?" Annie ignored the whispers and focused on the auctioneer, a thin man with a clipboard who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Behind him stood a county official holding a thick folder marked Dusthaven Township, tax defaulted property. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the courthouse square, "we're here today for the public auction of Dusthaven Township, Lincoln County, Nevada. Property consists of approximately 43 structures on 120 acres of desert land. Bidding starts at $100. A murmur ran through the crowd. One of the suited men stepped forward, but before he could speak, Annie's clear voice cut through the desert air. $100! Every head turned toward her. The auctioneer blinked in surprise, then looked around for other bidders. The suited men exchanged glances, clearly debating whether it was worth competing with a child over what they probably considered worthless desert real estate. "Going once," the auctioneer said uncertainly. "$150, called out one of the suits, more to save face than from any real interest. Annie's heart sank. She didn't have $150. But before panic could set in, she heard Duke's low growl and felt his warm presence against her leg. She thought about her mother's voice, about bedtime stories where brave children faced impossible odds and found ways to win. $150, she said firmly. "But I'd like to know what you gentlemen plan to do with a ghost town." The man who'd bid looked uncomfortable. "Development, tourist attraction maybe." "Tear it down, more likely," Annie said, her voice carrying further than she'd intended. "Turn it into strip malls or parking lots. That town has been waiting 60 years for someone who actually cares about it." The crowd stirred, some nodding in agreement. Mrs. Hendricks called out, "Let the girl have it, Jim. What's $50 to men like that anyway?" The suited men conferred briefly, then the leader shook his head at the auctioneer. They weren't interested in a bidding war over desert property, especially not with a child who'd somehow turned public opinion in her favor. Going once. Going twice. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Sold to the young lady for $150. Annie's knees nearly buckled with relief. Somehow, impossibly, she'd done it. She was the owner of an entire town. 2 hours later, after signing papers she barely understood and handing over the money that represented 3 years of careful saving, Annie climbed into the passenger seat of Sheriff Martinez's patrol car. The sheriff had volunteered to drive her out to Dusthaven, partly from curiosity and partly from a genuine concern about a 9-year-old girl heading into the desert alone. "You sure about this, Mia?" he asked as they pulled out of town. "It's pretty isolated out there. No electricity, no running water, and some folks say that it's haunted," Annie finished. "I know. But ghosts don't scare me, Sheriff. It's the living that usually cause the trouble." Sheriff Martinez glanced at her in the rearview mirror, noting the wisdom in her voice that seemed far too old for her years. Duke sat alert in the back seat, his head out the window, nose testing the desert wind as they drove deeper into the emptiness of Lincoln County. The road to Dusthaven was little more than a dirt track that wound between sagebrush and Joshua trees. After 20 minutes of driving, Annie saw it rising from the desert floor like a mirage. Weathered wooden buildings clustered around a main street that led nowhere, their windows dark and empty as eye sockets. "There she is," Sheriff Martinez said softly. Dusthaven. The town was smaller than Annie had imagined, but somehow more real. These weren't movie-set facades or tourist attractions. These were buildings where people had lived and worked and loved and lost. She could feel their history in the very air, a weight of memory that pressed against her chest. Sheriff Martinez parked in front of what had once been the town's general store. The wooden sign hanging over the door was so faded that Annie could barely make out the words Morrison's Goods and Sundries. Next to it stood a saloon with swinging doors that creaked in the desert wind, and beyond that, a small church with a bell tower that leaned slightly to one side. "The boarding house is down there," the sheriff said, pointing to a two-story building at the end of the main street. "Probably your best bet for shelter. It's got the most solid roof anyway." Annie nodded, but she was already stepping out of the car, drawn by something she couldn't name. Duke leaped out beside her, immediately beginning to sniff around the dusty street with intense interest. His tail was up, his ears forward, the posture of a dog who'd found something fascinating rather than threatening. "I'll check in on you tomorrow," Sheriff Martinez said. "Make sure you're settling in okay. You got my number if you need anything before then." Annie waved as he drove away, leaving her alone with Duke in the ghost town of Dusthaven. The silence was profound. No traffic, no voices, no sounds of modern life. Just the whisper of wind through empty buildings and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. She walked slowly down the main street, Duke padding beside her, both of them taking inventory of their new home. The buildings were in better condition than she'd expected. Weathered, yes, and showing 60 years of neglect, but still standing proud against the desert sky. The boarding house stood at the end of the street like a grand dame holding court. It was 3 stories tall, with a wraparound porch and intricate woodwork that spoke of a time when Dusthaven had been prosperous. The front door stood slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond. Annie pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. Duke close behind. The interior was dim and dusty, but she could see the bones of former elegance. A grand staircase leading to the upper floors, a parlor with a massive stone fireplace, a dining room with a long table that could seat 20 people. But it was Duke who made the discovery that would change everything. The German shepherd had wandered into what looked like a storage room behind the main parlor, his nose working overtime as he investigated something near the far wall. Annie followed the sound of his excited whining and found him pawing at a pile of old furniture and debris that seemed to have been deliberately stacked against the wall. "What is it, boy?" she asked, kneeling beside him. Duke's behavior was unlike anything she'd seen before. He was focused, almost frantic, as if he could smell something specific beneath the pile of broken chairs and moldy curtains. Annie began, pulling items away, surprised by how heavy some of them were and how deliberately they seemed to have been placed. After 15 minutes of work, she uncovered what Duke had been after. An old door, its iron hinges black with rust and its wooden surface scarred by decades of neglect. But unlike the other doors in the boarding house, this one was set into what appeared to be a stone wall rather than wood framing. Annie ran her hands over the door's surface, feeling the rough texture of carved symbols that had been worn smooth. By time, at the center was an iron ring that might once have served as a handle, though it was now green with verdigris. "This doesn't belong here, does it, Duke?" she murmured. The dog whined softly and pawed at the base of the door, where a thin line of cool air seemed to be seeping through. Annie knelt and put her face close to the gap, feeling the unmistakable sensation of air movement. There was space behind this door, a lot of space. She grasped the iron ring and pulled. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting metal and a shower of rust flakes, the door shifted slightly. Annie pulled harder, putting her full weight into it, and suddenly the door swung open with a shriek of hinges that echoed through the boarding house like a banshee's wail. Beyond the door lay darkness and the scent of deep earth. Stone steps descended into blackness, worn, smooth by countless footsteps. Cool air flowed up from the depths, carrying with it the faint scent of minerals and something else, something that made Duke's hackles rise and his lips pull back in a silent snarl. Annie peered into the darkness, her heart pounding with excitement and fear in equal measure. This wasn't just a basement or a root cellar. The stairs were too well constructed, too deliberate. Someone had built this passage with care and purpose, then hidden it away from the world above. "Well, Duke," she said softly, her voice echoing slightly in the underground space, "I guess we know why they really abandoned this town." Duke whined again, torn between his protective instincts and his trust in Annie's judgment. Whatever lay below, it was important and dangerous. Annie stood at the threshold between the known and unknown, between her new life above ground and the mysteries that waited in the darkness below. In her hand, she still clutched her mother's locket, its familiar weight a reminder of the courage that ran in her blood. Tomorrow, she would need light and rope and all the careful planning that such an exploration demanded. But tonight, she would make the boarding house habitable and try to understand what she had stumbled into. As she closed the door and began dragging furniture back into place, Annie couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken a turn towards something far greater and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. She owned a town, yes, but it seemed the town owned a few secrets of its own. Annie woke to the sound of Duke's low growl and the creak of floorboards overhead. Pale dawn light filtered through the dusty windows of the boarding house parlor, where she'd made a temporary bed, using cushions from an old sofa. Her hand instinctively went to the baseball bat she'd found in one of the upstairs rooms. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. The sounds came again, deliberate footsteps on the porch, then the squeal of the front door opening. Annie rose silently, Duke at her side, both of them moving toward the hallway with practiced stealth born from too many nights hiding from Rita's drunken rages. "Hello?" called a gravelly voice. "Anyone home? I saw the smoke from your fire last night." Annie relaxed slightly. The voice belonged to an older man, and there was something respectful in his tone that suggested he wasn't here to cause trouble. Still, she kept the bat ready as she stepped into view. The man standing in her doorway was ancient, probably in his 70s, with skin like weathered leather and pale blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore clean but faded clothes and a hat that had seen better decades. In his hands was a wicker basket covered with a red checkered cloth. "You must be the little girl who bought the town," he said, removing his hat politely. "I'm Henry Hartwell. Live about 10 miles north of here. Brought you some breakfast and supplies." "Thank you," Annie said cautiously. "I'm Annie Grant. This is Duke." Mr. Hartwell's eyes fixed on the German shepherd with unexpected intensity. "Fine-looking dog. Smart, too, I'd guess. You'll need that out here." He set the basket on the parlor table and began unpacking it. Fresh bread, eggs, bacon, coffee, and a thermos of what smelled like hot soup. Annie's stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she'd eaten nothing but stale crackers since yesterday. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Hartwell, but why—" "Because neighbors help neighbors," he interrupted gently, "and because I've been waiting a long time for someone to come back to Dusthaven, though I'll admit I expected someone a bit older." Annie studied his face as she bit into the bread. There was something he wasn't saying, some weight behind his words that made her think this visit wasn't entirely about neighborly kindness. "You know about this place," she said. It wasn't a question. Mr. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes distant. "I was born here," he said finally. 1951, lived here until the fire in 63. I was 12 when we left. Then you remember what really happened." "I remember enough." His voice carried a warning that made Duke's ears prick forward. "Enough to know that some things are better left. Buried. This town has secrets, child, dark ones. You'd be wise to sell it and move on." Annie set down her bread and looked at him steadily. "I don't have anywhere else to go, and I'm not afraid of secrets." "You should be." Mr. Hartwell glanced toward the back room where the hidden door lay concealed. "Some secrets have teeth." The Tata comment sent a chill down Annie's spine, but she kept her expression neutral. "If you're trying to scare me away, it won't work. I bought this town fair and square, and I'm staying." Mr. Hartwell studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I can see you've got steel in you. Good, you'll need it. He stood and replaced his hat. I'll check on you in a few days. Keep that door close and don't go wandering underground alone. After he left, Annie sat in the morning sunshine streaming through the parlor windows, trying to process the encounter. Mr. Hartwell knew about the door. That much was obvious from his final warning. But was he trying to protect her or threaten her? And how much did he really know about what lay beneath Dusthaven? She spent the morning making the boarding house more livable, dragging mattresses downstairs and sweeping decades of dust from the main rooms. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, she found a trunk full of mining equipment, coils of rope, carbide lamps, and tools she didn't recognize. Most interesting was an old miner's lantern, brass and glass with a wick that still held oil. The lantern felt heavy and solid in her hands, its brass surface polished smooth by years of use. When she lit it, the flame burned steady and bright, casting dancing shadows on the bedroom walls. It seemed like a sign, the perfect tool for exploring whatever lay beyond the hidden door. But first, she needed to clear away the debris more thoroughly. Annie spent the afternoon in the storage room, systematically removing furniture and examining the door more carefully. In daylight, she could see the carved symbols more clearly, geometric patterns that seemed almost ritualistic, and at the center, the image of what looked like a 5-petaled flower or star. Duke remained agitated around the door, alternating between protective alertness and curious investigation. He would approach, sniff carefully, then back away with a small whine before starting the process again. "What do you smell down there, boy?" Annie asked, running her hand over his neck. "Something good or something bad?" Duke's amber eyes met hers, and for a moment she could swear she saw intelligence there that went beyond normal canine awareness. He was trying to tell her something, but she didn't yet speak his language well enough to understand. As afternoon turned to evening, Annie finally cleared the last of the debris from around the door. The iron ring turned more easily now, and when she pulled, the door swung open with only a whisper of protest. Cool air flowed up from below, carrying scents of stone and earth and something else, something metallic that made her think of old coins. The stone steps descended into darkness beyond the reach of her lamp. They were worn smooth in the center, evidence of heavy use over many years. The walls were roughly cut stone, fitted together with the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of permanent construction rather than temporary mining tunnels. Annie tested the first step carefully. The stone held firm under her weight. She descended 3 more steps, holding the lantern high, Duke following reluctantly behind her. The passage curved slightly to the right, preventing her from seeing how far it extended. At the 5th step, she stopped. Something glinted in the lamplight, a piece of metal embedded in the wall. Annie held the light closer and gasped. It was a brass nameplate, green with age but still readable. Theodore Morrison, Foreman, Desert Rose Mine Company, 1889. "Duke," she whispered, "this isn't just a basement. This is part of the old mine." But if that was true, why was it hidden behind a door in the boarding house? And why did Mr. Hartwell seem so frightened of it? Annie backed up the steps, her mind racing. She needed to research the history of Dusthaven more thoroughly before venturing deeper underground. There were too many questions and not enough answers, and Mr. Hartwell's warning echoed in her memory. Some secrets have teeth. As she secured the door and began arranging furniture to conceal it again, Annie made a mental list of what she needed to know. Who was Theodore Morrison? What was the Desert Rose Mine Company? And most importantly, what had really happened during the fire of 1963? That night, she lay on her makeshift bed with Duke curled beside her, listening to the desert wind whistle. Through the empty buildings of Dusthaven, somewhere in the darkness beyond her windows, secrets waited to be uncovered. But Annie was learning that the most dangerous discoveries often came to those who were too eager to find them. She clutched her mother's locket and made herself a promise. She would learn the truth about Dusthaven, but she would be careful. She would be smart, And she would never forget that in a town full of ghosts, the living could be far more dangerous than the dead. 3 days later, Annie stood at the bottom of the stone steps, with the miner's lantern held high, Duke pressed close against her leg. She'd spent the intervening time preparing, gathering rope, tools, and enough courage to face whatever lay. In the darkness below, the passage stretched ahead of her, carved from living rock with a skill that spoke of professional miners rather than hasty excavation. The walls bore tool marks that had been worn smooth by time and the passage of many feet. Every few yards, brass plates mounted on the stone marked intersections and distances. Main gallery, 50 feet. Shaft 3, north. Foreman's office, east tunnel. This wasn't just a mine. It was an entire underground complex. Annie moved forward, carefully, counting her steps and mentally mapping each turn. The main passage continued straight for nearly 100 feet before opening into a natural cavern that took her breath away. Her lantern light reflected off crystal formations in the walls, and the ceiling soared high above, lost in shadows that her small flame couldn't penetrate. But it was what she found in an alcove carved into the eastern wall that made her heart race. A leather-bound journal, wrapped in oiled cloth and tucked into a metal box that had protected it from decades of moisture and decay. Annie opened the journal with trembling fingers. The first page bore an inscription in faded but still, legible ink, property of Theodore Morrison, foreman, Desert Rose Mine Company. Private journal, 1889 to 1963. Duke whined softly, his nose working overtime as he investigated scents too faint for human detection. Something about this place made him uneasy, but he trusted Annie enough to follow her lead. Annie turned to a random page and began reading by lantern light. June 15th, 1962. The Brotherhood met again last night. Marcus Webb grows more insistent about the treasure maps, claiming his grandfather's rights supersede our charter. I've told him repeatedly that the artifacts belong to the Order, not to individuals. The silver and gold are merely tools to preserve. Our true mission, protecting the sacred sites and maintaining the old knowledge. August 3rd, 1962. Webb has been asking questions about the main vault. I fear he's learned more than is safe. Tonight I moved the most valuable pieces deeper into the complex. The Desert Rose Formation in Chamber 7 will hide them until this crisis passes. March 12th, 1963. It's decided. We can no longer trust Webb's family line. The fire will serve two purposes. It will convince the outside world that we're all dead, and it will force us to relocate before Webb can betray everything we've built. The evacuation is planned for tomorrow night. God willing, we'll all meet again in Colorado come spring. Annie's hands shook as she turned the pages, absorbing the implications of what she was reading. The Great Fire of 1963 hadn't been an accident. It had been a carefully orchestrated deception. The miners hadn't died. They'd faked their deaths and disappeared, taking their secrets with them. But the journal's final entry, dated March 13th, 1963, was different. The plan is compromised. Webb has betrayed us to outside forces. Men with guns arrived this afternoon, demanding access to the vaults. We managed to seal the main passages, but not before 3 of our people were killed. The fire will happen tonight as planned, but now it serves to cover our escape rather than our deception. I'm leaving this journal as a record of the truth. Whoever finds it, beware. The Webb family will never stop hunting for what they believe is rightfully theirs. The artifacts must remain hidden until someone worthy of the trust appears. Look for the sign of the Desert Rose. Annie closed the journal, her mind reeling. She wasn't just the owner of a ghost town. She was the inheritor of a legacy that people had died to protect, and apparently somewhere in these tunnels lay treasures valuable enough to kill for. Duke's sudden growl interrupted her thoughts. The German shepherd was staring back toward the passage they'd entered through, his hackles raised and his body tense. Annie quickly doused the lantern, plunging them into absolute darkness. In the silence that followed, she heard what Duke had detected first. Footsteps on the stone stairs above, slow and deliberate, as if someone was trying to move quietly. Annie's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself against the cavern wall. Duke, a warm, reassuring presence beside her. The footsteps paused at the bottom of the stairs, then continued into the main passage. A thin beam of electric light swept the tunnel walls, moving methodically toward their hiding place. The beam paused at the cavern entrance, then swept across the space where Annie crouched in the darkness. She held her breath, praying that whoever was searching couldn't detect their presence in the vast underground space. "I know you're down here, little girl." The voice was unfamiliar, male, with a slight accent she couldn't place. "I saw your lamplight from outside. We need to talk." Annie remained silent, her hand moving to Duke's head to keep him calm. The German shepherd was coiled like a spring, ready to attack if given the command. "My name is Marcus Webb," the voice continued. "Theodore Morrison mentioned me in that journal you've been reading. I think it's time we discussed what you've found." The name sent ice through Annie's veins. According to the journal, the Webb family had betrayed the Brotherhood 60 years ago, leading to deaths and forcing the survivors into hiding. And now a Webb was here, in her tunnels, looking for the same treasures his family had killed for decades ago. "I'm not here to hurt you," Webb called out, his voice echoing off the cavern walls. "I just want what belongs to my family. The old miners stole it from us, and I'm here to claim it back." Annie gritted her teeth. The journal had made it clear that the Webb family's claims were false, that Marcus's grandfather had tried to steal artifacts that belonged to the Brotherhood. This was exactly the kind of situation Theodore Morrison had warned about. The flashlight beam swept closer to their hiding spot. In another few seconds, Webb would find them. Annie made a quick decision, remembering the journal's mention of other passages and chambers. If she could lead Webb away from the main cavern, she might be able to lose him in the tunnel system. She relit her lantern with shaking hands and stepped into view. "I'm here," she called out, "but if you want to talk, we do it on my terms." Webb appeared in the cavern entrance, a tall man in expensive outdoor gear, with the kind of confidence that came from money and power. His smile was meant to be reassuring, but it didn't reach his eyes. "There you are. I was beginning to worry that you'd gotten lost down here. These old tunnels can be dangerous for someone who doesn't know their way around. I know my way around." "Just fine," Annie said, backing toward a passage she'd noticed earlier. "This is my property, and you're trespassing." "Technically, yes, but I think when you understand the situation better, you'll see that we can help each other. I have resources. You need money, equipment, expertise. You have access to something my family has been searching for since 1963. You mean the treasures your grandfather tried to steal before getting people killed?" Webb's smile faltered. "I see you've been reading Morrison's propaganda." The old man had a very one-sided view of history. "My family has legitimate claims to artifacts that were stolen from us by Morrison's little cult." "The Brotherhood wasn't a cult," Annie said, continuing to back toward the side passage. Duke moved with her, never taking his eyes off Webb. They were protecting sacred artifacts and historical sites. They were treasure hunters who used fancy names to justify theft. Webb's voice hardened. "My great-grandfather discovered this site in 1888. He filed the original mining claims. Everything in these tunnels belongs to the Webb family by right." Annie felt the opening of the side passage behind her. "Then why didn't you bid on the town at auction? If you had such strong claims, why let a 9-year-old outbid you?" "Because I needed someone else to find the entrance first. These old miners were clever about hiding their work. I've been searching for the main complex for 20 years. The admission confirmed Annie's growing suspicion that Webb's interest in Dusthaven wasn't coincidental. He'd been watching, waiting for someone to uncover what the Brotherhood had hidden, and now that she'd done the dangerous work of exploration, he wanted to claim the rewards. Well, you found it, Annie said, but finding and owning are two different things. This is my property, and I want you to leave. Webb laughed, a sound with no humor in it. I'm afraid it's not that simple anymore. You see, once certain parties learn that the Desert Rose complex has been located, your ownership becomes academic. There are people who've been waiting decades for this moment. What people? Collectors, government agencies, academic institutions, religious groups. The artifacts hidden in these tunnels represent multiple cultures spanning centuries. Some very powerful people have very specific interests in acquiring them. Annie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. Webb wasn't just talking about himself, he was threatening her with an entire network of people who would do anything to get their hands on whatever lay hidden in the deeper chambers. I think this conversation is over, she said, raising her lantern as if to leave. I'm afraid not. Webb's voice turned cold. You see, you've already seen too much to simply walk away. But I'm prepared to be generous. Sell me the town for a fair price, say $50,000, and I'll ensure you get safely relocated somewhere nice. Refuse, and I can't guarantee what happens next. The threat was unmistakable. Annie's hand found Duke's head, and she felt the big dog's muscles tense under her touch. One word from her, and Duke would attack. But Webb was a grown man, probably armed, and Annie couldn't risk her dog's life. On a fight, they might not win. Instead, she made a different choice. I need to think about it, she said. Give me 24 hours. Webb nodded, apparently satisfied that he'd made his point. 24 hours? But understand, Annie, this is the only generous offer you'll receive. Other interested parties won't be so accommodating. As Webb turned to leave, Annie called out one final question. How did you know I'd found the entrance? He paused at the cavern mouth. I've had people watching Dusthaven for years. The moment you arrived, I knew it was only a matter of time. You have that look about you, the kind of curiosity that doesn't leave stones unturned. After his footsteps faded up the stone stairs, Annie stood in the darkness for a long time. Duke pressed against her leg. The journal felt heavy in her hands, weighted with the responsibility of protecting secrets that had already cost lives. She thought about Webb's threats and his mention of other interested parties. Theodore Morrison had been right to hide the artifacts. There were people who would kill for them. But Morrison had also written about looking for someone worthy of the trust. Annie touched her mother's locket, drawing strength from the connection to her family's courage. She was 9 years old, alone except for a German shepherd, facing dangers she barely understood. But she was also the legal owner of Dusthaven and everything beneath it. That had to count for something. 24 hours. That was how long she had to figure out how to protect the Brotherhood's legacy and keep herself alive in the process. As she climbed back toward the surface, journal clutched tightly in her hands, Annie made a decision. She wouldn't be selling Dusthaven to Marcus Webb or anyone else, but she also couldn't face this alone. It was time to find allies. Annie drove into Cedar Falls the next morning in Sheriff Martinez's patrol car, Duke in the back seat, and Theodore. Morrison's journal hidden beneath her jacket. The sheriff had agreed to give her a ride to the library after she'd called him with a carefully edited version of recent events, mentioning Webb's visit but not the underground complex. You sure you don't want me to have a talk with this Webb fellow? Sheriff Martinez asked as they pulled up to the Cedar Falls Public Library. Sounds like he was trying to intimidate you. I can handle it, Annie said, though her stomach churned with nervousness. I just need to do some research first. The library was a small brick building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, but the librarian who greeted them was sharp-eyed and helpful. Sarah Chen appeared to be in her early 30s, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of efficient manner that suggested she could find any piece of information given enough time. Sheriff Martinez, she said warmly, and you must be Annie Grant. Word travels fast in a town this size. I heard you bought Dusthaven. Yes, ma'am. I'm hoping you might have some historical records about the town. Old newspaper articles, maybe. or mining company documents. Sarah's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a researcher presented with an interesting puzzle. Dusthaven is one of my favorite local history topics. We have quite a collection. Why don't you start with the newspaper archives while I pull together everything else we have? Annie spent the next 2 hours immersed in microfilm and old newspaper files, Duke lying patiently at her feet. The story that emerged was fascinating and troubling in equal measure. Dusthaven had been founded in 1887 by the Desert Rose Mine Company, a consortium of investors from San Francisco who'd bought mining claims from local prospectors. The town had grown rapidly, reaching a peak population of nearly 300 people by 1920. But the newspaper accounts of the 1963 fire painted a picture that didn't match Theodore Morrison's journal. According to the Cedar Falls Gazette, the fire had started in the boarding house and spread rapidly through the wooden buildings. 23 people had died, including most of the mine's leadership. The survivors had evacuated immediately, claiming the mine was played out anyway, and there was no reason to rebuild. But Annie noticed inconsistencies in the coverage. The list of victims included Theodore Morrison and 12 other men that the journal identified as Brotherhood members. Yet the bodies were reportedly too badly burned for identification, and no autopsies were performed. The mine complex was sealed immediately after the fire, with county officials citing safety concerns about unstable tunnels. "Finding everything you need?" Sarah asked, appearing with an armload of additional files. "Maybe too much," Annie muttered. "Ms. Chen, what do you know about the Webb family?" Sarah's expression grew more serious. "The Webbs have been in this area since the 1880s. Wealthy family, made their money in mining and land speculation. Marcus Webb Sr. was involved with several mining operations around here, including some claims near Dusthaven. What about his grandson, the current Marcus Webb? He's something of a local mystery. Inherited a fortune when his father died. Travels. Frequently deals in what he calls historical acquisitions. Some people say he's an antiquities dealer. Others think he's more of a treasure hunter." "Why do you ask?" Annie hesitated, then decided that Sarah's help was worth the risk of partial honesty. "He visited me yesterday. Wanted to buy Dusthaven. Said his family had claims to artifacts that might be hidden there." Sarah frowned and pulled out a thick folder marked "Webb Family Legal Disputes." "That sounds like Marcus. He's been involved in several lawsuits over the years, claiming ownership of items found on properties his great-grandfather once held claims to. Most of his cases get settled out of court." "Settled how?" "People sell to him rather than fight expensive legal battles. Marcus has more money than most folks around here can afford to spend on lawyers." Annie felt her heart sink. If Webb's usual strategy was to overwhelm people with legal costs, what chance did a 9-year-old have of fighting him? "But," Sarah continued, "there might be something else you should know." She pulled out a yellow document from the bottom of the folder. "This is a copy of a territorial charter from 1889. It established something called the Order of the Desert. Rose as a legal entity with specific rights to protect archaeological and cultural sites in this region." Annie's pulse quickened. "What kind of rights?" "Broad ones, actually. The Charter gives the Order authority to establish protected sites, regulate access to historical artifacts, and maintain those protections in perpetuity. It was signed by the territorial governor and never rescinded. Does the order still exist? That's the interesting question. Legally, it never dissolved. But there's been no recorded activity since 1963. If someone could prove they were the legitimate heir to the order's leadership, they would have significant legal protections for any historical sites under their care." Annie felt a spark of hope. Theodore Morrison's journal had made multiple references to looking for someone worthy of carrying on the Brotherhood's mission. Could she be that person? How would someone prove they were the legitimate heir? Sarah smiled. That would depend on the Order's internal governance documents. The Charter mentions that the order maintained detailed records of succession and membership, but those records were never filed with territorial authorities. If they still exist, they'd probably be wherever the order kept their private documents. There. Private documents? Annie repeated slowly, thinking of the vast tunnel complex beneath Dusthaven. Exactly. The charter also mentions something called the Seal of Authority, a physical object that serves as proof of legitimate leadership. Without that seal, any claim to order leadership would be much harder to establish. Annie spent another hour reviewing Sarah's files, taking careful notes and asking detailed questions about local legal procedures. When she finally looked up, she realized Duke had been remarkably patient for a young dog in an unfamiliar environment. "Ms. Chen," she said carefully, "if someone did find evidence that the Order of the Desert Rose still had legal standing, what would that mean for property rights in the area?" "It would mean that any archaeological or cultural sites under order protection would be legally untouchable, regardless of surface property ownership. The territorial charter supersedes later county jurisdiction in matters of historical preservation." Annie felt a surge of excitement. If she could find the Order's governance documents and prove her right to inherit their authority, she might have legal protection against Webb and anyone else who wanted to claim Dusthaven's treasures. "Would you be willing to help me research this further?" she asked. Sarah's eyes sparkled with professional curiosity. "I'd be delighted. This is exactly the kind of historical mystery I love working on." "When do you want to start?" "How about now?" Annie said, then paused. "But I should warn you, this might get complicated. There are people who have strong interests in keeping some of this history buried. The best history usually does involve people who'd rather it stayed hidden," Sarah said with a grin. "That's what makes it worth uncovering." As they left the library with copies of the most important documents, Annie felt like she'd found not just an ally, but a potential friend. Sarah Chen was smart, resourceful, and genuinely interested in helping Annie understand the legal complexities of her situation. But as they walked to Sheriff Martinez's car, Duke suddenly tensed, his hackles rising as he stared across the street. Annie followed his gaze and saw a black sedan with tinted windows parked in front of the hardware store. The car hadn't been there when they'd arrived. "Miss Chen," Annie said quietly, "that car across the street, do you recognize it?" Sarah looked where Annie was pointing, and her expression grew concerned. "I've never seen it before. In a town this small, you notice unfamiliar vehicles." The sedan's engine started as they approached the patrol car. As Sheriff Martinez pulled away from the library, Annie watched in the side mirror as the black car followed them for several blocks before turning away down a side street. "Duke saw them first," she murmured, running her hand through the German shepherd's fur. "Good boy." But as they drove back toward Dusthaven, Annie couldn't shake the feeling that her 24-hour deadline was approaching faster than she'd hoped. Webb had said there were other interested parties, and it seemed they were already moving to position themselves around her. The question was whether she could find the Order's legal protections and establish her authority before Webb and his allies decided that patience was no longer in their best interests. That evening, Annie descended into the tunnel complex with new purpose, carrying both her miner's lantern and a flashlight Sarah had insisted she borrow. The journal's references to the Order's governance documents had given her hope, but she needed to find them before Webb's deadline expired. Duke seemed more comfortable underground now, his earlier nervousness replaced by focused alertness. Together, they explored passages that branched off from the main cavern, following the brass markers that indicated different areas of the complex. The passage marked Archive Chamber Southeast led deeper into the mountain than Annie had ventured before. After nearly 15 minutes of careful progress, she found herself in a circular room carved directly from the living rock. The walls were lined with stone shelves, and though many were empty, several still held metal document boxes, similar to the one that had protected Theodore Morrison's journal. Annie set her lantern on a central stone table and began examining the boxes systematically. Most contained mining records, geological surveys, and correspondence about ore prices and equipment purchases. But the box marked Order of the Desert Rose governance documents made her heart race. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, she found what she'd been hoping for: articles of incorporation, membership rolls, meeting minutes, and most importantly, a detailed succession protocol. According to the documents, leadership of the order passed through bloodline inheritance when possible, but could also be granted to individuals who demonstrated both worthiness and need. The criteria for worthiness were specific: courage in the face of danger, wisdom beyond one's years, and a demonstrated commitment to protecting historical and cultural treasures. The criteria for need were simpler. The Order's assets must be under threat, and existing leadership must be unavailable. Annie realized with growing excitement that she might actually qualify on both counts. She'd shown courage by confronting, web and wisdom by seeking legal research before acting. And the Order's assets were definitely under threat, with Theodore Morrison and the other Brotherhood members long gone. But it was the final document in the box that made her gasp aloud. A detailed map of the entire underground complex, showing passages and chambers she hadn't even suspected existed. And in the deepest chamber, marked with the symbol of a 5-petaled flower, was something labeled Sacred Vault, Seal of Authority. According to the map, the Sacred Vault was accessible through a passage that began behind what looked like a natural rock formation in the main cavern. Annie gathered up the documents and hurried back to the central chamber, Duke trotting beside her with what almost looked like excitement. The rock formation was exactly where the map indicated, but it took Annie several minutes to find the hidden mechanism that opened it. When she pressed a specific sequence of stone protrusions, directions helpfully noted in the margin of the map, a section of the wall swung inward to reveal another passage. This tunnel was different from the others. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and decorated with the same 5-petaled flower symbol she'd seen on the hidden door in the boarding house. The air here felt different too, charged with a sense of significance that made Duke's ears prick forward with interest. The passage ended at an ornate door made of some dark metal that hadn't rusted despite decades of underground moisture. At its center was a lock shaped like the 5-petaled flower, and beside it, carved in the stone, were instructions in multiple languages, including English. Let the worthy inherit the authority of protection. Let the seal pass to hands that will honor the trust. Annie examined the lock carefully. It required not a key, but a specific object that would fit into the flower-shaped opening. She thought about the documents she'd just found, particularly Theodore Morrison's references to the sign of the Desert Rose. Then she remembered something she'd seen in the archive chamber, a small wooden box she'd dismissed as unimportant. Racing back through the passages, she retrieved the box and opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a piece of crystalline stone, carved into the exact shape of the flower symbol. The desert rose crystal was beautiful in its simplicity, clear as water, but shot through with veins of silver and gold that caught the lantern light. When Annie held it up, it seemed to pulse with inner light, as if it had been waiting decades for her touch. Back at the sacred vault, the crystal fitted into the lock perfectly. There was a soft clicking sound, and the metal door swung open to reveal a chamber that took Annie's breath away. The sacred vault was relatively small, but every surface gleamed with careful preservation. Stone pedestals held artifacts that Annie recognized from museum visits: pottery, jewelry, tools, and artwork representing multiple Native American cultures. But it was the central pedestal that drew her attention. There, on a circle of polished obsidian, lay an ornate silver ring set with a desert rose crystal larger than the one Annie held. Even in the lamplight, she could see intricate engravings around the band, symbols that seemed to shift and change as she watched. This had to be the seal of authority mentioned in the governance documents. According to the succession protocol, whoever possessed the seal had full legal authority over all order assets and protections. Annie reached for the ring with trembling fingers, then hesitated. Taking it would change everything. She would no longer be just a 9-year-old girl who'd bought a ghost town. She would be the leader of an organization that had protected priceless cultural treasures for over a century. But as she thought about Marcus Webb's threats and his mention of other interested parties, Annie realized she didn't really have a choice. These artifacts needed protection, and she was the only one in a position to provide it. When her fingers touched the ring, Annie felt a strange sensation, as if electricity were flowing through the metal into her hands. The desert rose crystal in the setting seemed to pulse with warm light, and for a moment she could swear she heard distant voices whispering words of encouragement and welcome. The ring was too large for her finger, but when she slipped it onto her thumb, it seemed to adjust itself to fit perfectly. Annie looked down at her hand in amazement. The seal of authority felt warm and alive against her skin, as if it recognized her right to wear it. Duke whined softly, pressing against her leg. When Annie looked into his amber eyes, she saw something that made her catch her breath: intelligence, and approval that went far beyond normal canine understanding. It was as if Duke had been waiting for this moment too. "Well, boy," she whispered, her voice echoing in the sacred vault, "I guess we're really in this now." As they made their way back through the tunnels toward the surface, Annie felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just protecting her own property, she was protecting a legacy that spanned generations and cultures. But she was also aware that Webb's deadline was approaching rapidly. In less than 12 hours, he would expect an answer to his generous offer. And somehow, Annie doubted that "I'm now the legally recognized leader of a territorial organization with authority over these artifacts" would be the response he was hoping for. She needed to contact Sarah Chen immediately. If the Order of the Desert Rose really did have the legal standing that the territorial charter suggested, she might have protection against Webb and his allies. But first, she had to survive long enough to establish her claim. As she secured the hidden door and arranged furniture to conceal it, Annie noticed that Duke's behavior had changed. The German shepherd was more alert, more focused, as if wearing the seal had somehow enhanced his natural protective instincts. Outside, the desert night was quiet except for the wind through the empty buildings of Dusthaven. But Annie could feel watching eyes in the darkness, and she knew that Webb's people were out there, waiting for her decision. What they didn't know was that she'd already made it. She wasn't selling Dusthaven to anyone. She was going to fight for it with every legal tool at her disposal and every ounce of courage she could muster. The Order of the Desert Rose had found its new leader. Now it was time to see if that would be enough to protect what had. Annie woke before dawn to the sound of vehicles approaching Dusthaven. Through the boarding house windows, she could see headlights cutting through the desert darkness, more than one car moving slowly and deliberately toward the town. Duke was already on his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The German shepherd positioned himself between Annie and the front door, his body tense with protective alertness. Annie slipped the seal of authority onto her thumb and gathered the order's documents into her backpack. Whatever was about to happen, she needed to be ready. The vehicle stopped in front of the boarding house, Marcus Webb's black sedan and a white SUV that Annie didn't recognize. She watched from behind the dusty curtains as Webb stepped out, followed by two men in business suits who moved with the careful precision of professional security. But it was the elderly man who emerged from the SUV that made Annie's breath catch in her throat. Henry Hartwell, the neighbor who'd brought her breakfast and warned her about the town's secrets, walked directly to Webb and shook his hand like an old friend. "She's inside," Hartwell said, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "The girl found the entrance 3 days ago. She's been exploring the tunnels extensively." Annie felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. Henry Hartwell, the man who'd seemed so concerned about her safety, had been working with Webb all along. He'd been watching her, reporting on her activities, playing the role of concerned neighbor while serving as Webb's spy. Any sign that she's found the main vault? Webb asked. Almost certainly. She was down there for hours yesterday, and when she came up, she was carrying documents. Old ones by the look of them, Webb nodded grimly. Then we're out of time. The girl has proven more resourceful than I expected, but this ends now. The group moved toward the boarding house, and Annie heard Webb's voice calling out, "Annie! I know you're awake. We need to talk." Annie made a quick decision. Rather than wait for them to break down the door, she would meet them outside on her own terms. She slipped her backpack on, made sure the seal was secure on her thumb, and stepped onto the front porch with Duke at her side. "Mr. Webb," she said calmly, "you're early. I thought we agreed on 24 hours. Circumstances have changed," Webb replied. "I've learned that you've discovered more than either of us initially discussed. That changes the nature of our negotiation. And Mr. Hartwell," Annie continued, her voice carefully controlled despite the betrayal she felt, "I suppose your concern for my safety was just an act?" Hartwell had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I was trying to protect you, child. Marcus's family has been searching for the Desert Rose complex for generations. When you appeared, I hoped I could convince you to leave before things got complicated." "Complicated?" Annie laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "You mean before your friend here decided to steal artifacts that don't belong to him?" Webb stepped forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Those artifacts belong to my family by right of original discovery. My great-grandfather found this site in 1888. Everything in those tunnels should have passed to the Webb family when he died." "Except that's not what happened," Annie said. "Your great-grandfather tried to steal artifacts that belonged to the Order of the Desert Rose. When the Brotherhood discovered his betrayal, they forced him out and relocated the treasures to protect them." Webb's eyes narrowed. "I see you've been reading Theodore Morrison's version of events. The old man was a skilled propagandist, I'll give him that, but you're missing some crucial context." One of Webb's security men handed him a leather folder, which he opened to reveal old photographs and documents. "These are the real records of my great-grandfather's work in this area. He wasn't trying to steal anything. He was trying to prevent the Order from smuggling priceless artifacts out of the country." Webb held up a photograph showing men loading wooden crates onto a train. "The Order of the Desert Rose wasn't a preservation society, Annie. They were artifact smugglers, selling Native American cultural treasures to private collectors in Europe. My great-grandfather tried to stop them, and they destroyed his reputation in revenge." Annie felt her certainty waver. The photograph looked genuine, and Webb's explanation would account for some of the inconsistencies she'd noticed in Theodore Morrison's journal. "Even if that were true," she said carefully, "it wouldn't give you legal claim to artifacts found on my property." "Actually, it would." Webb pulled out another document. "This is a copy of a federal court order from 1889, authorizing my great-grandfather to recover stolen artifacts and return them to their rightful tribal owners. That order was never rescinded. It gives the Webb family legal authority to claim any artifacts discovered in connection with the Order of the Desert Rose." Annie's heart sank as she looked at the official court seal on the document. If Webb was telling the truth about his family's legal authority, then everything she'd discovered about the Order's protections might be meaningless. But then Henry Hartwell spoke up, and his words changed everything. "Marcus," he said quietly, "I think it's time to tell her the rest." Webb shot him a sharp look. "Henry, she deserves to know the truth. All of it." Hartwell turned to Annie, and for the first time since he'd arrived, his expression showed genuine remorse. "I haven't been entirely honest with you, child. My real name is Henry Morrison. Theodore Morrison was my grandfather." Annie stared at him in shock. "Your grandfather?" "I was born here in Dusthaven in 1951. I lived here until I was 12, when the fire forced us to evacuate. But the fire wasn't what Marcus told you it was. And it wasn't what my grandfather's journal recorded either. Webb tried to interrupt, but Hartwell held up his hand. Marcus, the girl has a right to know what she's inherited and what she's risking by getting involved in this. Hartwell sat down heavily on the boarding house steps, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. The truth is that both versions of the story are partially correct. The Order of the Desert Rose was smuggling artifacts, but not to sell them. They were trying to protect Native American cultural treasures from being stolen by collectors and museums. He looked at Annie with sad eyes. My grandfather and his friends weren't criminals, but they weren't saints either. They made decisions that got people killed, and Marcus's family has been hunting for the artifacts ever since, believing they were stolen from them. But the real secret, Hartwell continued, is that there was a third party involved. A government agency that wanted to acquire the artifacts for national security reasons. When the Order refused to cooperate, this agency arranged for the Webb family to be granted legal authority to seize everything. Annie felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The federal court order was obtained through false testimony and manufactured evidence, Hartwell confirmed. The government wanted plausible legal cover for seizing artifacts that might have strategic value. They used Marcus's great-grandfather as their front man. Webb's face had gone pale during Hartwell's revelation. "Henry, you can't be serious. Are you saying my family was being manipulated?" "I'm saying your family was used, just like mine was. The difference is that my grandfather figured it out before it was too late. The fire in 1963 wasn't staged to cover the Order's escape. It was staged to fake everyone's deaths, so the government couldn't find them." Hartwell pulled out a document of his own, yellowed with age but bearing official seals. This is the real territorial charter for the Order of the Desert Rose. It grants the Order permanent protection over archaeological sites in this region, superseding any later federal authority. My grandfather hid the original before he disappeared. Annie looked at the charter and felt the seal of authority pulse warm against her thumb. The document was exactly what Sarah Chen had described, legal protection that would trump Webb's court order. "But there's more you need to understand," Hartwell said. "The agency that was hunting my grandfather's people never gave up. They've been waiting for someone to rediscover the Desert Rose complex, and they're not interested in legal niceties." As if summoned by his words, the sound of helicopter rotors filled the desert air. Annie looked up to see two black helicopters approaching. From the east, moving fast and low, Webb cursed under his breath. "They followed us. I thought we had more time." "Who followed you?" Annie demanded. "The same people who've been hunting these artifacts since 1963, Hartwell said grimly. "And they're not coming here to negotiate." The helicopters circled once, over Dusthaven, then landed in clouds of dust and sand. Men in dark tactical gear poured out, surrounding the boarding house with military precision. A woman in an expensive suit emerged from the lead helicopter and walked directly toward the group on the porch. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Good morning. I'm Director Sarah Black, Department of Cultural Assets Recovery. By federal authority, this site is now under government jurisdiction. Everyone will need to come with us for debriefing." Annie felt Duke press against her leg, his growl barely audible but continuous. The German shepherd's instincts were screaming danger, and Annie trusted them completely. She looked at the seal of authority on her thumb, then at Henry Hartwell's worried face, then at the armed agents surrounding her property. "I don't think so," she said quietly. Director Black raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry." Annie held up her hand, showing the seal. "I am the legally recognized leader of the Order of the Desert Rose, operating under territorial charter with authority. Over this site, you're trespassing on protected land." The director's expression shifted to one of intense interest. "So you found it. We wondered if Morrison had passed the succession along before he disappeared." "What do you want with these artifacts?" Annie asked. "What we've always wanted. to protect America's interests by ensuring that certain cultural treasures don't fall into the wrong hands. Some of the items hidden in these tunnels have significance beyond their historical value. You mean you want to steal them for the government? Director Black smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I prefer to think of it as protective custody, but regardless of semantics, you're coming with us. All of you. The tactical agents began moving closer, and Annie realized that her legal authority meant nothing to people who were willing to operate outside the law. But as the first agent reached for her arm, Duke exploded into action. Duke's attack caught the tactical agents completely off guard. The German Shepherd moved with lightning speed, knocking the first agent backward and giving Annie the split second she needed to sprint toward the boarding house door. "The tunnels!" Henry Hartwell shouted. "Get to the tunnels!" Annie raced through, the boarding house with Duke at her heels. Behind them, the sounds of shouting and confusion as Director Black's agents tried to regroup. Annie reached the storage room and began frantically pulling furniture away from the hidden door. Hartwell appeared beside her, moving with surprising speed for his age. "I know another way," he said. "Follow me." Instead of heading for the rusted door, he led her to what looked like a solid wall in the corner of the room. But when he pressed a specific sequence of stones, a section of the wall swung inward to reveal a narrow passage. "Emergency exit," he explained breathlessly. "My grandfather was paranoid about having multiple escape routes." Duke's attack caught the tactical agents completely off guard. The German Shepherd moved with lightning speed, knocking the first agent backward and giving Annie the split second she needed to sprint toward the boarding house door. "The tunnels!" Henry Hartwell shouted. "Get to the tunnels!" Annie raced through the boarding house with Duke at her heels. Behind them, the sounds of shouting and confusion as Director Black's agents tried to regroup. Annie reached the storage room and began frantically pulling furniture away from the hidden door. Hartwell appeared beside her, moving with surprising speed for his age. "I know another way," he said. "Follow me." Instead of heading for the rusted door, he led her to what looked like a solid wall in the corner of the room. But when he pressed a specific sequence of stones, a section of the wall swung inward to reveal a narrow passage. "Emergency exit," he explained breathlessly. "My grandfather was paranoid about having multiple escape routes." They plunged into the darkness just as boots thundered through the boarding house above. Annie clutched her lantern and followed Hartwell. Through a passage that was smaller and rougher than the main tunnels, clearly designed for quick escape rather than regular use. "Where does this lead?" she whispered. "To the old mine office, 200 yards from the main complex. But we can't stay there long. They'll find it eventually." Behind them, Annie could hear the agents discovering the main entrance. Lights flickered in the darkness as they began their descent into the tunnel system. The escape passage ended at a rusty ladder, leading up to a trapdoor concealed beneath a pile of mining equipment. Hartwell pushed the door open cautiously, checking for threats before motioning Annie and Duke to follow. They emerged in a small stone building that Annie had noticed during her explorations of Dusthaven, but hadn't yet investigated. Charts and maps covered the walls, and a large desk dominated the center of the room. "Theodore Morrison's office," Hartwell explained. "He spent most of his time here during the last years of the mine operation, planning the Order's activities and keeping records." Annie looked around with new understanding. "This is where he coordinated everything." "Yes, and this is where he hid the most important documents." Hartwell moved to the desk and opened what looked like an ordinary drawer. But when he pressed a hidden lever, the bottom of the drawer swung down to reveal a secret compartment. Inside were documents that made Annie's eyes widen. Detailed maps of other Order sites across the Southwest, lists of artifacts and their locations, and most importantly, a comprehensive record of every person who had joined the Order since its founding. "The complete membership rolls," Hartwell said, "including descendants who might not even know about their family connections. If we can get word to them, the order could reconstitute itself with full legal authority. Annie studied the lists, noting names and locations scattered across Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. How many people are we talking about? Nearly 200 direct descendants, many of them in positions of influence: lawyers, judges, law enforcement, academic institutions. The order's founders were careful to recruit people whose families could provide long-term protection. The sound of helicopters circling overhead reminded them that time was running short. Through the office windows, Annie could see tactical agents spreading out across Dusthaven, systematically searching every building. "We need to contact these people," Annie said. "But how? We don't have communication equipment, and even if we did, actually, we do." Hartwell moved to another wall and opened what looked like a maintenance panel. Behind it was a sophisticated radio setup that looked far more modern than anything else in the building. "My grandfather wasn't the only one who planned ahead," Hartwell said with a slight smile. "I've been maintaining the Order's communication network for decades, waiting for this day." He began flipping switches and adjusting dials. Soon, the radio crackled to life with voices from across the region. "Desert Rose Base to all stations," Hartwell spoke into the microphone. "This is Henry Morrison, grandson of Theodore. The artifacts are under immediate threat. Requesting emergency assembly of all available descendants." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Voice after voice checked in, identifying themselves by family names that Annie recognized from the membership. Roles: lawyers in Las Vegas, sheriffs in rural counties, museum directors, university professors, all of them descendants of the original Order members, all of them ready to activate legal protections that had been dormant for 60 years. "This is Sarah Chen in Cedar Falls," came a familiar voice that made Annie's heart leap. "I have copies of the territorial charter and supporting documentation. Filing emergency injunctions now with federal court." "Chen?" Hartwell looked at Annie in surprise. "You contacted Dr. Chen?" "Dr. Chen, she's the town librarian." Hartwell laughed, the first genuinely happy sound Annie had heard from him. "Sarah. Chen has a doctorate in Native American law and serves as a federal consultant on tribal artifact protection. She's also the great-granddaughter of one of the Order's founding members. She's been waiting for this moment as long as I have." More voices continued checking in over the radio. Annie listened in amazement as a network of legal protections spread across multiple states, with injunctions being filed, law enforcement being alerted, and media contacts being activated. "Federal marshals are en route to your location," reported a voice from Las Vegas. "Director Black's agency has been operating without proper jurisdiction. They're about to find themselves in serious legal trouble." But even as hope began to build, Annie realized they still faced immediate danger. Legal protection would mean nothing if Director Black's agents reached the sacred vault before help arrived. "Mr. Hartwell," she said urgently, "there's something else we need to discuss. When I found the seal of authority, it wasn't just sitting there waiting. The vault was protected by some kind of mechanism, something that might be dangerous if the wrong people tried to access it." Hartwell's expression grew serious. "What kind of mechanism?" "I'm not sure exactly, but when I put the crystal key into the lock, I felt something activate. The whole chamber seemed to respond to the seal somehow. My grandfather mentioned something about that in his private notes. He called it the Guardian Protocol, a failsafe designed to protect the most sacred artifacts if the vault was ever breached by unauthorized personnel." "What does it do?" "According to the notes, it seals the entire complex permanently. Anyone inside, when it activates, would be trapped." And he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. "Can it be controlled?" "Only by someone wearing the seal of authority. But it requires a conscious choice. The bearer has to deliberately activate it by placing the seal into a specific receptacle in the sacred vault." The radio crackled with urgent voices reporting that Director Black's helicopters were landing. Reinforcements. Time was running out faster than Annie had hoped. "Mr. Hartwell," she said slowly. "If those agents reach the sacred vault, they'll take everything. All the artifacts that your grandfather and his friends died to protect. Yes, but if I activate the Guardian Protocol, it would preserve everything. Permanently. At the cost of anyone inside the complex, including yourself." Annie looked down at the seal of authority on her thumb, feeling its warm weight against her skin. She thought about Theodore Morrison's journal entries about finding someone worthy of the trust. She thought about the voices on the radio, descendants of brave people who had sacrificed everything to protect cultural treasures. "There might be another way," she said. "What if we could evacuate the artifacts before activating the protocol, move the most important pieces to safety?" Hartwell shook his head. "There are hundreds of items, some of them extremely fragile. It would take days to move everything safely. Then we save what we can and protect the rest." Duke whined softly and pressed against Annie's leg. The German shepherd seemed to sense the gravity of the decision she was contemplating. Through the office windows, they could see flashlight beams moving toward the mine office. Director Black's agents had found their hiding place. "Annie," Hartwell said gently, "you don't have to do this. You're 9 years old. No one would expect you to—" "I'm not just 9 years old," Annie interrupted, touching her mother's locket. "I'm the leader of the Order of the Desert Rose, and that means protecting what we've been entrusted with, no matter the cost." She moved to the radio microphone. "This is Annie Grant, current bearer of the Seal of Authority. I need to speak with Sarah Chen immediately." Sarah's voice came through clearly. "I'm here, Annie. What do you need?" "Legal question. If the Order's sacred sites are permanently sealed to prevent theft, does that affect our territorial charter protections?" "Actually, it strengthens them. Sealed sites receive the highest level of federal protection under archaeological preservation laws. No one would be able to disturb them without congressional approval." Annie nodded, her decision crystallizing. "Then I know what we have to do." The sound of boots on the building's front steps meant their time for planning was over. It was time to act. "Mr. Hartwell," Annie said, "show me the fastest way back to the sacred vault. We have artifacts to save and a legacy to protect." As flashlight beams swept across the windows and voices shouted commands outside, Annie felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. She was about to make a choice that would change everything, for herself, for the Order, and for the cultural treasures that had been hidden beneath Dusthaven for over a century. But she was ready. She had Duke beside her, allies supporting her across multiple states, and the authority of generations of protectors flowing through the seal on her thumb. It was time to fulfill the trust that Theodore Morrison had placed in whoever would be worthy enough to inherit it. The agents burst through the mine office door just as Annie, Duke, and Hartwell disappeared down another concealed shaft behind the desk. This passage was even narrower than the escape route, barely wide enough for Hartwell's shoulders, but it led directly into the heart of the tunnel complex. "How many more of these passages are there?" Annie whispered as they emerged into the main cavern. "Dozens," Hartwell replied. "My grandfather designed this place like a maze. He knew that someday people might come hunting for what the Order protected." Behind them, they could hear Director Black's voice echoing through the tunnels as her agents spread out to search the complex. She was coordinating the search with military precision, dividing her forces to cover multiple routes simultaneously. "Split up into teams of 3. Black's voice carried clearly in the underground acoustics. "Priority target is the girl with the ring. Secondary objective is locating the main artifact repository. Remember, some of these items have strategic value beyond their historical significance." Annie felt the seal pulse warm against her thumb, as if responding to the threat. "Strategic value?" she whispered to Hartwell. "Some of the artifacts contain rare minerals or represent advanced metallurgy techniques that were lost centuries ago. The government has always been interested in anything that might have technological applications." They reached the sacred vault passage, but Annie paused at the entrance. "Mr. Hartwell, Before we go in there, I need to know the truth about my family. You said succession passes through bloodlines when possible. Am I here by coincidence, or is there something you haven't told me? Hartwell's weathered face showed a mixture of pride and sadness. Your great-great-grandmother was Maria Santos, one of the Order's founding members. She was Theodore Morrison's closest advisor and the keeper of the cultural protocols that governed how we handled Native American artifacts. Annie stared at him in shock. My great-great-grandmother. Maria married a man named Grant and moved to California in 1895. The family lost touch with the Order after that, but the bloodline remained pure. When you showed up at that auction, I recognized something in your bearing, the same determination Maria had when she fought to protect sacred sites from exploitation. So I was meant to be here. You were called here. There's a difference. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. Director Black's agents had found the main passage to the sacred vault. Time was running out fast. The Guardian Protocol, Annie said urgently. How exactly does it work? According to my grandfather's notes, the seal fits into a receptacle in the center of the sacred vault. When activated, it triggers ancient mechanisms that seal every entrance permanently. But Annie, I know anyone inside gets trapped. But what about the artifacts themselves? Will they be safe? Completely. The vault was designed to preserve its contents indefinitely. Climate-controlled, sealed from moisture and contamination. Everything inside would be protected forever. Annie nodded grimly. Then we save what we can carry and activate the protocol. The most important pieces will be preserved even if we can't save everything. They entered the sacred vault, just as the first tactical lights appeared in the main cavern behind them. Annie moved quickly among the pedestals, selecting the smallest and most culturally significant artifacts, pieces of jewelry, carved tools, ceremonial items that could fit in her backpack. Duke positioned himself at the vault entrance, his hackles raised and his amber eyes fixed on the approaching lights. The German shepherd's protective instincts were in full alert mode, ready to defend Annie against any threat. There! Director Black's voice echoed from the main chamber. The passage is behind that rock formation. Move in carefully. The girl might be armed. Annie worked frantically, wrapping delicate artifacts in her spare clothing and tucking them safely into her pack. Each piece she saved represented not just historical value, but cultural identity that belonged to people whose ancestors had created these treasures. Annie, Hartwell said softly, you don't have to do this alone. I can activate the Guardian Protocol. I've lived my life. You still have yours ahead of you. No, Annie's voice was firm despite her fear. The seal responds to me now. It has to be me. She moved to the central pedestal where the Guardian Protocol receptacle waited, a circular depression carved into the obsidian surface, sized perfectly for the seal of authority. Around it, carved in multiple languages, were the same words she'd seen on the vault door. Let the worthy inherit the authority of protection. Flashlight beams swept across the vault entrance as the first agents reached the passage. In seconds, they would be inside. Annie placed her hand on the receptacle, but didn't insert the seal yet. Mr. Hartwell, when this activates, how long do we have? According to the notes, about 60 seconds from activation to complete seal. The mechanisms are mechanical, designed to work even after centuries of neglect. 60 seconds, Annie calculated. Rapidly. The main cavern was perhaps 30 seconds away at a full sprint. If she activated the protocol and ran immediately, she might make it out before the seals engaged. But as the first tactical agent appeared in the vault doorway, Annie realized that escape was no longer an option. "Nobody move!" the agent shouted, his weapon trained on Annie. "Step away from whatever you're doing and put your hands where I can see them." More agents poured into the vault, followed by Director Black herself. The government official looked around the sacred vault with undisguised greed, her eyes cataloging the priceless artifacts that surrounded them. "Well done, Miss Grant," Black said. "You've saved us considerable time and effort by leading us directly to the primary repository." "These artifacts don't belong to you," Annie said, her hand still hovering over the Guardian Protocol receptacle. "They belong to the American people, and I represent the American government. That gives me authority over anything found on American soil." "You represent thieves," Hartwell said angrily. "Just like the people who drove my grandfather into hiding." Director Black ignored him, focusing entirely on Annie. "Remove your hand from whatever mechanism you're touching and step away slowly. Some of these artifacts are extremely valuable, and we can't risk damage from hasty actions." Annie felt the seal's warmth spreading up her arm, as if the ring were responding to the threat facing the Order's treasures. In her backpack she could feel the weight of the artifacts she'd managed to save, a fraction of what lay in the vault, but something at least. "What happens to these artifacts if I give them to you?" she asked. "They'll be properly catalogued and stored in secure facilities where they can be studied and protected." "You mean hidden away, where no one can see them again?" "I mean protected from people who might misuse them for personal gain." Annie looked around the sacred vault one more time, taking in the beauty and cultural significance of every piece. These weren't just historical artifacts. They were the artistic and spiritual legacy of people who had lived and loved and created beauty in harsh desert conditions. They deserved better than to be locked away in government warehouses or sold to private collectors who saw them only as investments. "Duke," Annie said quietly, "come here, boy." The German shepherd moved to her side, pressing against her leg in a gesture of absolute trust and loyalty. Whatever Annie decided, Duke would stand with her. "Last warning," Director Black said. "Step away from that mechanism immediately, or my agents will remove you by force." Annie looked at Hartwell, seeing understanding and approval in his eyes. Then she looked at the seal of authority on her thumb, remembering Theodore Morrison's words about finding someone worthy of the trust. I'm Annie Grant," she said loudly, her young voice carrying clearly through the sacred vault. "Great-great-granddaughter of Maria Santos, legal owner of Dusthaven Township, and current bearer of the seal of authority for the Order of the Desert Rose." She pressed the seal firmly into the Guardian Protocol receptacle. "And I choose to protect what has been entrusted to me." The moment Annie pressed the seal into the receptacle, the sacred vault came alive with ancient mechanisms. A deep rumbling filled the air as stone blocks began sliding into place, sealing passages with the inexorable movement of precisely engineered machinery. "What have you done?" Director Black screamed, lunging toward Annie. But Duke was faster. The German shepherd intercepted Black's charge, knocking her backward into her agents as the first emergency lighting activated throughout the tunnel system. Red lights cast eerie shadows on the vault walls as warning signals echoed through the complex. 60 seconds, Hartwell shouted over the mechanical noise. "The main exit will seal last. We can still make it." But as they reached the vault entrance, Annie realized their escape route was already blocked. A massive stone slab had descended from the ceiling, sealing the passage to the main cavern. They were trapped in the sacred vault with Director Black. "And her agents, you little fool," Black raged. "You've killed us all." Annie felt a moment of panic, then noticed something the adults had missed. Duke wasn't acting trapped or frightened. Instead, the German shepherd was pawing at what looked like a solid section of the vault wall, whining with excitement. "Mr. Hartwell," Annie called out, "Duke's found something." Hartwell looked where Annie was pointing, and his face lit up with understanding. "The Founder's Passage. I'd forgotten about the Founder's Passage." He pressed a specific sequence of stones near where Duke was scratching, and a section of the wall swung inward to reveal another tunnel, smaller than the others but clearly maintained. Maria Santos had this built as her private route to the surface, Hartwell explained rapidly. "It exits near the church, completely separate from the mine complex." Director Black and her agents moved toward the newly opened passage, but Annie stood in their way. "This passage was built by my great-great-grandmother for Order members only," she said firmly. "You're not Order members. I don't care about your family history," Black snarled. "Move aside or..." The rumbling grew louder as more sealing mechanisms activated. Through the vault's crystal formations, they could hear the sound of massive stone blocks sliding into final position. In perhaps 30 seconds, even the Founder's Passage would be sealed forever. Annie made a choice that surprised everyone, including herself. Mr. Hartwell, Duke, go. Get to the surface and make sure the Order survives to protect other sites. I'm not leaving you, Hartwell protested. You have to. Someone needs to coordinate with the descendants, make sure the legal protections hold. And Duke... Annie knelt beside the German shepherd, burying her face in his fur. You need to be free, to protect other people who need you. Duke whined and licked her face, clearly understanding that she was saying goodbye, but unwilling to leave her behind. Go, Annie commanded, using every ounce of authority she could muster. Protect the Order. With obvious reluctance, Duke followed. Hartwell into the Founder's Passage. The old man paused at the entrance, tears streaming down his weathered face. Your great-great-grandmother would be proud, he said. The Order will remember what you've done here. Then they were gone, racing through the narrow passage toward the surface as the sacred vault sealing mechanisms reached their final phase. Annie turned to face Director Black and her agents, all of whom were staring at her with a mixture of fury and disbelief. You've murdered us, one of the agents said. No, Annie replied calmly. I've protected something that's more important than any of our individual lives. These artifacts represent the cultural heritage of entire peoples. They're worth preserving. Director Black laughed bitterly. Noble words from a child who doesn't understand the real world. Some of these artifacts could advance scientific knowledge by decades. Medical applications, materials science, archaeological techniques, all lost now because of your romantic notions about cultural preservation. Or maybe, Annie said, some knowledge is meant to be preserved rather than exploited. Maybe the people who created these artifacts understood something about respect and stewardship that we've forgotten. The rumbling stopped suddenly, leaving them in absolute silence, except for the quiet hum of the emergency lighting. The sacred vault was now completely sealed from the outside world, its contents protected for eternity. But as the reality of their situation settled in, Annie felt an unexpected sense of peace. She touched her mother's locket, thinking about the courage that seemed to run in her family's blood. She'd made a choice that honored both her ancestors and the people whose cultural treasures surrounded them. There has to be another way out, one of the agents said desperately, examining the walls for hidden passages. Annie watched them search, knowing they would find nothing. The Guardian Protocol had been designed by people who understood that some things were worth dying to protect. The sealing was complete and irreversible. But then she noticed something that made her heart leap with hope. The seal of authority was glowing softly on her thumb, pulsing with the same rhythm as her heartbeat, and in that glow she could see symbols appearing on the vault walls, symbols that hadn't been visible before. The Preservation Protocol, she whispered, remembering something from Theodore Morrison's journal. It's not just about sealing the vault, it's about preserving life as well as artifacts. She moved to the central pedestal, where the seal receptacle still glowed with soft light. New symbols were appearing around it, and as Annie studied them, she began to understand what the Order's founders had really built. The sacred vault wasn't a tomb, it was an ark. The preservation systems didn't just protect artifacts from decay, they were designed to sustain human life indefinitely. Air recycling, water purification, even food production from underground mineral springs that fed hidden growing chambers. We're not trapped, Annie said with growing excitement. We're preserved. The vault is designed to keep its occupants alive until the outside world is ready to respect what's protected here. Director Black stared at her. That's impossible. No ancient civilization had that kind of technology. The Order wasn't ancient, Annie replied. Theodore Morrison and his people were brilliant engineers who learned from multiple cultures and scientific traditions. They built this place to last forever, with or without outside support. As if responding to her understanding, New sections of the vault wall began to glow, revealing passages that led to chambers she'd never seen before. The sacred vault was revealing its full nature as a completely self-sustaining environment. Annie looked at the Director Black and her agents, people who had come here to steal cultural treasures for their own purposes, but who were now as dependent on the Order's preservation technology as she was. "We can survive here," she said, "all of us, but not as thieves or conquerors. If we're going to share this space, we share it as protectors. We learn to respect what the Order built and what it represents." For the first time since entering the vault, Director Black looked uncertain rather than angry. The reality of their situation was sinking in. They could fight each other and probably all die, or they could find a way to coexist in the extraordinary environment the Order had created. Annie held up her hand, showing the seal of authority glowing softly in the preservation chamber's light. "I'm still the leader here," she said quietly. But I'm willing to teach anyone who wants to learn what it really means to protect cultural heritage." As the emergency lighting shifted to a warmer, more sustainable glow, Annie realized that her adventure was far from over. She'd saved the artifacts and protected the Order's legacy, but now she had an entirely new challenge: building a community of protectors in the most extraordinary library and museum ever created. And somewhere above, she knew Duke and Henry Hartwell were working with the Order's descendants to ensure that what happened in the sacred vault would be remembered and honored by the outside world. The Order of the Desert Rose had found its new beginning. 6 months later, Annie stood on the front porch of the boarding house in Dusthaven, watching a team of archaeologists carefully document the town's surface structures. In her hand, she held a new document, the charter establishing Dusthaven as the first officially recognized indigenous cultural preservation site under joint federal and tribal authority. Duke bounded up the steps to greet her, his tail wagging with the enthusiasm of a dog who'd found his perfect purpose in life. The German shepherd had grown sleeker and more confident during their months together, becoming not just Annie's companion, but the unofficial guardian of an entire network of protected sites across the Southwest. "Any word from below?" asked Sarah Chen, who now served as the site's official academic coordinator, while maintaining her position as the Order's legal representative. Annie touched the small communication device that connected her to the sacred vault. Director Black's voice came through clearly, though her tone had changed dramatically from the authoritarian commands of 6 months ago. "Surface team, this is Vault Base. We've completed the cultural protocols training for the new artifacts in Chamber 7. Dr. Standing Bear confirms that everything is being handled according to tribal specifications." "Acknowledged, Vault Base," Annie replied. "The tribal representatives will be here tomorrow for the monthly consultation. Is everything prepared for the video conference?" "Ready as always, Director Grant." Annie smiled at the title. The Order's Descendant Network had officially recognized her as Director of Cultural Preservation, a position that carried legal authority over multiple archaeological sites and cultural protection initiatives. It was a big responsibility for someone who'd turned 10 just last month, but Annie had learned that age mattered less than wisdom and courage. Henry Hartwell emerged from the town's new museum building, wiping dust from his hands and grinning with satisfaction. At 73, he discovered a new lease on life as the site's historical coordinator and primary link between the surface operations and the preserved community below. "The new exhibits are ready for the tribal delegation," he reported. "We've got representatives from 6 different nations coming tomorrow to review how their cultural materials are being displayed and interpreted." Annie nodded approvingly. One of the Order's founding principles, which she'd insisted on maintaining, was that Native American cultural materials were always interpreted by Native American experts, with full tribal consultation on every aspect of preservation and presentation. "How's the school project coming along?" she asked. "Better than expected. We've got applications from families on 4 reservations who want to send their children here for traditional cultural education combined with modern academics. The boarding house will be perfect for housing students who want to spend extended time learning from the artifacts and the preservation techniques. Annie looked out over Dusthaven with deep satisfaction. The ghost town had been transformed into something unprecedented, a living laboratory where ancient cultural wisdom was preserved alongside cutting-edge conservation science. Students, researchers, and tribal members worked together to ensure that indigenous knowledge was both protected and passed on to future generations. But it was the underground community that represented the most remarkable transformation. In the months since the Guardian Protocol had activated, Director Black and her agents had evolved from would-be thieves into dedicated protectors. The Sacred Vault's preservation systems had given them the time and isolation needed to understand what they'd almost destroyed. Dr. Standing Bear, a Navajo archaeologist who joined the underground community voluntarily, had become their cultural education coordinator. Under his guidance, Director Black and her team had learned not just how to preserve artifacts, but why preservation mattered to the people whose ancestors had created them. Director Grant, came another voice through the communicator. This is Agent Martinez from Vault Base. We're ready to begin the video conference with the Hopi Cultural Committee about the pottery collection. Thank you, Agent Martinez. Connecting. You now. Annie activated the video link that connected the Sacred Vault with tribal representatives across the region. The technology was a careful blend of the Order's engineering expertise and modern digital communication, allowing the underground community to participate fully in cultural consultation processes. As she listened to the respectful dialogue between former government agents and tribal elders, Annie marveled at how much had changed. The people who'd once seen artifacts as government assets now understood them as living connections to cultural identity and spiritual tradition. Annie, Sarah said quietly, I just got word from Senator Williams's office. The congressional hearing on the Cultural Preservation Act is scheduled for next month. They want you to testify about how the Dusthaven model could be applied to other sites. Annie felt a familiar mix of excitement and nervousness. Speaking to Congress about cultural preservation was a far cry from buying a ghost town with $100 bill, but it was the logical next step in protecting indigenous heritage on a national scale. Will Duke be allowed in the hearing room? She asked. I think we can arrange that. He's technically a certified service animal for cultural preservation sites now. Duke's ears perked up at the mention of his name, and he moved to press against Annie's leg with the solid reassurance that had become their constant communication. In the months since their adventure began, the bond between girl and dog had deepened into something that approached telepathy. A dust cloud on the horizon announced the arrival of more visitors, researchers from the Smithsonian who'd come to study the Order's preservation techniques. Annie watched them approach with the confidence of someone who'd learned to balance protection with education, secrecy with sharing. You know, Henry Hartwell said, settling into one of the rocking chairs. On the boarding house porch, your great-great-grandmother would be amazed by what you've accomplished here. Maria Santos dreamed of a place where cultural treasures could be protected and honored simultaneously. You've made that dream a reality. Annie touched her mother's locket, feeling the connection to both her recent family and her deeper heritage. I think she'd be proud that we found a way to keep the Order's mission alive while making it bigger than any of us imagined. Speaking of bigger, Sarah said with a grin, I got a call from the governor's office. They want to nominate you for the state's Youth Leadership Award. Only if Duke gets nominated too, Annie replied seriously. None of this would have happened without him. As afternoon turned to evening, Annie stood on the porch, watching the sun set over the desert that had become her home. In the distance, she could see the lights beginning to come on in the research facilities that now surrounded Dusthaven. Scientists, Students, tribal members, and tourists all came here to learn about the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern preservation. But it was the quiet communication from the sacred vault that gave her the deepest satisfaction. Below ground, a community of former enemies had become dedicated protectors, working daily to ensure that cultural treasures were preserved not just for their historical value, but for their ongoing spiritual and educational significance. Director Grant, came Director Black's voice through the communicator. We've finished cataloging the new artifacts from the Colorado site. Everything has been documented according to tribal protocols, and we're ready for the video consultation with the Ute Nation tomorrow. Excellent work, Director Black. The Order appreciates your dedication. There was a pause. Then Black's voice continued with an emotion that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Thank you, Annie, for showing us what protection really means. Annie smiled and closed the communication link. Around her, Dusthaven settled into the peaceful rhythm of evening. Researchers completing their work, students reviewing their lessons, and the quiet hum of preservation systems that worked around the clock to protect irreplaceable cultural heritage. Duke stretched out beside her chair, his amber eyes watching the desert with the contentment of a guardian who'd found his perfect post. In the last 6 months, he'd become something of a legend himself, the dog whose instincts had helped uncover one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in American history. Well, boy, Annie said, scratching behind his ears, ready for tomorrow's adventures? Duke's tail thumped once against the porch boards, a sound so subtle that only Annie would have noticed, but which carried all the promise of continued partnership in whatever challenges lay ahead. As stars began to appear in the clear desert sky, Annie reflected on the journey that had brought her here. A year ago, she'd been a foster child with no real home and no sense of belonging. Now she was the leader of an organization that protected cultural treasures across multiple states, the director of a groundbreaking preservation site, and most importantly, someone who'd found her true family in the most unexpected places. The Order of the Desert Rose had evolved far beyond what Theodore Morrison could have imagined when he wrote his worried journal entries 60 years ago. What had started as a small group of miners trying to protect Native American artifacts had become a model for cultural preservation that balanced scientific research with indigenous wisdom, academic study with spiritual respect. Time for dinner, Sarah called from inside the boarding house. Mrs. Martinez sent over her famous green chili stew. Annie stood and stretched, Duke immediately rising to follow her inside. The boarding house had been restored to its former elegance but adapted for modern needs, a combination of historical preservation and practical functionality that embodied everything the Order now represented. As they sat around the large dining table that had once hosted mining executives and investors, Annie looked at the faces of her chosen family. Henry Hartwell, whose wisdom and experience anchored their operations. Sarah Chen, whose legal expertise and academic knowledge protected their work, and Duke, whose unwavering loyalty and protective instincts had made everything possible. I got a letter today, Henry said, pulling out an envelope marked with official seals, from the Department of the Interior. They want to establish 5 more sites using the Dusthaven model, places where indigenous cultural materials can be preserved and interpreted with full tribal consultation. 5 more? Annie's eyes widened. That's wonderful, but can we handle that much expansion? Not we, Sarah said with a smile. The Order. Remember, we now have nearly 300 active descendants working in cultural preservation, legal protection, and academic research. You've built something much bigger than any individual site. Annie nodded thoughtfully. One of the most satisfying aspects of the past 6 months had been watching the Order's descendant network activate and grow. Lawyers, museum curators, university professors, and tribal leaders who'd never known about their connection to the original brotherhood had stepped forward to help protect cultural heritage sites across the Southwest. "There's something else," Henry continued. "The Smithsonian wants to partner with us on a major exhibition about indigenous cultural preservation. They're talking about featuring our work as a model for how museums can collaborate with tribal nations rather than simply taking artifacts for display." "What would that mean for the sacred vault?" Annie asked. "Nothing that would compromise our protection protocols. They want to showcase our methodology, not our actual artifacts. The goal is to teach other institutions how to work respectfully with indigenous communities." Annie felt a warm glow of pride. When she'd first activated the Guardian Protocol, she'd been focused on immediate protection. She'd never imagined that her choice would become a catalyst for changing how cultural preservation worked on a national scale. After dinner, Annie took Duke for their evening walk through Dusthaven's restored streets. The town now housed a permanent population of about 40 people. Researchers, students, tribal liaisons, and preservation specialists who'd made protecting cultural heritage their life's work. But it was during these quiet evening walks that Annie felt most connected to the spirits of the place. In the gentle desert wind, she could almost hear the voices of the original miners who'd risked everything to protect artifacts from exploitation. In Duke's steady presence beside her, she felt the continuity of protection that stretched from Theodore Morrison's generation to her own. "You know what I realized today?" she said to Duke as they paused in front of the old church. "This place taught me that home isn't something you find. It's something you create by protecting what matters most." Duke looked up at her with those intelligent amber eyes, and Annie could swear she saw understanding there. He'd found his purpose too, serving as guardian for a community dedicated to preserving the irreplaceable. They completed their circuit of the town and returned to the boarding house, where Annie checked in one final time with the Sacred Vault community. "Surface base, this is Director Black. All preservation systems are functioning normally. Dr. Standing Bear completed today's cultural protocols training with Agent Patterson, and we're ready for tomorrow's consultation with the Apache Nation about the silver work collection. Thank you, Director Black. Sleep well down there. You too, Annie. And thank you for everything." Annie powered down the communication system and prepared for bed, Duke settling into his accustomed spot on the floor beside her. But before turning off the lights, she opened Theodore Morrison's journal one more time, turning to the final entry that had started her on this incredible journey. "Look for the sign of the desert rose," she read aloud. "Whoever finds it, beware. The Webb family will never stop hunting for what they believe is rightfully theirs. The artifacts must remain hidden until someone worthy of the trust appears." Annie smiled and closed the journal. Marcus Webb had indeed never stopped hunting, but in the end, his pursuit had led to something far better than theft or exploitation. He'd become part of a community dedicated to protection rather than profit, learning to see cultural artifacts as living connections to ongoing traditions rather than mere objects to be owned. The desert rose crystal in the seal of authority pulsed softly on Annie's nightstand, catching the moonlight that streamed through her bedroom window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to expand the Order's work, and new chances to prove that cultural preservation could be both respectful and scientifically rigorous. But tonight, Annie was content to rest in the knowledge that she'd found her true calling. She was the protector of irreplaceable treasures, the leader of a growing movement, and most importantly, a link in an unbroken chain of people who understood that some things were worth more than money or power. "Good night, Duke," she whispered. "Tomorrow we'll start planning for those 5 new sites." Duke's tail thumped once against the floor, their private signal that meant agreement, partnership, and unshakable loyalty to whatever adventures lay ahead. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of nightbirds calling to each other across the vast Nevada landscape. Dusthaven slept peacefully under the star-filled sky, its secrets now protected not by burial and concealment, but by understanding and respect. And in the sacred vault far below, a community of former enemies worked together through the night, preserving and protecting cultural treasures that belonged not to any government or collector, but to all humanity's shared heritage. The Order of the Desert Rose had found its future. And that future was as bright as the stars that watched over the desert town, where a 9-year-old girl and her German shepherd had discovered that the greatest treasures weren't gold or silver, but the courage to protect what could never be replaced.